Good morning from Dakar, Senegal, the venue of the African Development Week 2017, and we're here to have important conversations about inequality, about growth, and about unemployment in the African continent. Joining me this morning to just shed some light on what to anticipate in terms of discussions today is Dr. Dimitri Sanga, who is the head of the West African Office for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Like I said, there's a lot of anticipation today, but what can we expect? What are some of the issues that will be brought on the table?
Yeah. We are expecting African ministers in charge of finance, planning and economic development to look into issues related to growth. As you might be aware, the African continent has been enjoying since the beginning of the century quite commendable growth on the continent. But during the last 2 to 3 years, due to low prices in commodities and so on, we have experienced the fact that this growth is decelerating. Now, before even the deceleration of growth, the growth that we enjoyed, we had so many countries even having 2-digit growth on the continent. But this didn't translate into improvement, substantial improvement into the livelihood of Africans.
Right.
At the African Union Commission and the ECA, Economic Commission for Africa, we did some research and found out it is because that growth was based on actually extraction of raw material and export of this raw material without further transformation on the continent. So this did not create enough jobs. This did not bring about some value added to these commodities. And if people do not have enough jobs, they don't have income to invest in the social areas, such as education, such as health. So during these 4 days that we'll be spending here, we will have exchange of experiences among African countries to see how we can bring about what we call the structural transformation of economies.
Right. Dr. Sanga, what is the biggest opportunity for equitable growth right now in Africa?
The biggest opportunity is the fact that the African continent is quite a young continent. We have 60% of Africans who are 25 and less. So this is a great opportunity if we manage to give them the education that is needed, and if we manage to keep them in good health, this youthful population will bring about the structural transformation that we need to move forward. And it will create enough employment. Right. It will also create the growth that can be redistributed.
Do we have those systems, Dr. Sanga, in our African setups that will usher this growth and give opportunity to the young people? Or if we were to set those structures, where do we start?
We shall start at a number of enablers of growth. These include infrastructure. We cannot go about transforming African economies if we don't have roads, if we don't have ports, if we don't have energy. To transform whatever raw material that we have on this continent, we need energy. And when you go across the continent, you will see that countries are in deficit of energy. So this is something in which many of the African countries have started investing so that we can bring about the structural transformation that we want.
Country-specific issues and questions are bound to make conversations here at the African Development Week 2017. In East Africa, there is the concern of quality of growth, whether it is just impressive GDP numbers or if indeed this growth is reflective on the ground.
Yes, effectively, I think the issue of inequality has been well recognised to be a serious challenge, I think, across Africa. In our sub-region, effectively there is this challenge of having relatively fast rates of economic growth, but not necessarily accompanied always by sufficiently fast rates of job creation. I think that's at the heart of the problem, actually, job creation, and also this shift of activities out of agriculture into higher valued activities in services, and particularly manufacturing. And that's also where we've seen a performance which is not as strong as we would have liked. In most East African countries, manufacturing has been relatively stagnant, which is something not necessarily desirable in terms of creating the job opportunities to bring more people out of poverty and reduce the inequality.
Right. Andrew, how do we unlock agriculture in the East African space? I mean, there's been a lot of talk of it being the backbone of the economy in this region, but really the contribution is still very dire, with many economies having it contribute less than 30% of the GDP.
Yes, well, I mean, over time, what you would like to see is people leaving agriculture and moving into higher value-added activities outside the agricultural sector. And we have seen that. I mean, you've seen a dramatic reduction in the percentage of workers in countries like Uganda, for example, in terms of the absolute numbers of people working in agriculture. The problem is they're not moving into necessarily high value-added activities. And the second problem is actually productivity in agriculture has been relatively lackluster. It hasn't been as strong as we would hope. Now, when you look at countries in East Asia which achieved rapid structural transformation of their economies in the context of high growth rates, they tended to have a strong performance in agriculture as well, high productivity in agriculture. Now, resolving that problem partially goes through greater investments in agriculture, in irrigation, for example. Irrigation levels are extremely low in Eastern Africa in most countries. And without proper irrigation and with the challenges of climate change, you're going to struggle. So there is a lot of things that could be done, per se, in the agricultural sector to boost productivity. But on the other hand, the long-term goal should not be to depend on agriculture. It needs to be to shift out of agriculture and facilitate that shift.
And let's talk about the young people for a moment. Do we have the requisite skills to ensure that this mass of population tips over as far as economic development and transformation is concerned in East Africa?
The skills set. Yes, well, I mean, governments across the region are making greater efforts in terms of expanding secondary education on the one hand and university as well. But it's expensive. It's an expensive matter. I do believe that governments do need to make those investments, even though some people would say it's at the risk of causing greater inequalities in educational outcomes, because some people believe that you must first deal with the primary education and have 100% coverage. Most countries are quite close to that, even in Eastern Africa. Actually, despite the relatively low per capita incomes, countries are near 95%, 90% enrollment rates in primary. But the real challenge going forward is to produce better qualified secondary school and university graduates. University education has expanded. I think there are concerns about the quality of that education across the sub-region. So yeah, more needs to be done. In some countries you see skills mismatches. Quite a lot of graduates coming out of university, but then they can't find employment. Something's wrong there, isn't it? Clearly, when you have the university graduates, but they're not finding the subsequent employment possibilities. So I think there's lots of areas we need to look in and discuss over this week.
And in Southern Africa, leaders and policymakers continue to grapple with the land question. Just how best does Africa maximize the potential that is land as a factor of production?
That for us in Africa, land is even much more than an economic product. Land is a spiritual product. People are tied to the land. The whole process of human living, from birth to death, has a linkage with land in Africa. So land is a spiritual product. It's much more than something of an economic value. If you are landless in Africa, the way you are viewed, no matter the kind of investment that you have, no matter the kind of stocks that you hold, if you are landless in Africa, you are deemed to be powerless. People don't respect you. So there's a spiritual dimension attached to land. But your question in terms of the how do we make those land productive, even if land redistribution were to be done, I think there are opportunities for small land holding as well. Given the fact that there's an employment dimension to land, and there's the issue of small-scale production, I think what the government needs to do in the long run, when I talk about being methodical and be very procedural, is to ensure that even when land is redistributed, it's not left fallow. If there is a very well organized process, there is a way in which smallholders themselves can be empowered, so that they move into transition straight away to make the best use of the land that they eventually get, not having the land for no purposes.
Are there laws that can set precedent to this? Are there markets that have successfully done this that we can learn from?
There are quite a number of experiences in which land distribution. I'm aware that Brazil never experienced the same thing, but they were able to redistribute land to accelerate the process of agricultural production in Brazil. Brazil moved from a net importer of agricultural products to next exporter. They are the world's biggest exporter of beef currently. So I think it's possible to do that. Like I said, what is important is that there should be national consensus and national dialogue. People should not think that there's a conspiracy agenda against it. We should build an inclusivity in which both the beneficiaries and those for whom land will be taken from sees the value and the justice implicit in what is to be done. National consensus around that, which makes it for all parties to be very happy at the end of the day.
That's all for today, but please make a date with us tomorrow, 1 o'clock Central African Time, for a look at Africa's biggest conversations on CNBC Africa at the African Development Week 2017.